Hello, and welcome to this final lecture of the course. The topic of this lecture is virtue ethics, which is the third major family of ethical theories, aside from utilitarian theories and Kantian theories. In order to get a good handle on virtue ethics, it's useful to go over utilitarianism and Kantianism from a slightly different angle, to look at not only the ways that they differ from each other, because we spend a lot of time talking about that, but also with some of the things that they have in common that virtue ethics is in fact going to differ with them over. Utilitarianism, for example, views the central question of ethics as which specific acts are morally good or bad. Right? If this is the way that you approach ethics or the questions of ethics, then you're likely to end up something like a consequentialist framework, because specific actions have consequences. The idea is if you're going to take one act from another, it seems like the only real difference between them is what one of them causes that the other one doesn't, or vice versa. While the Kantian views the central question of ethics as which types of actions are morally good or bad. And of course, action types don't have consequences. Instead, action types have features that make them all of the same type. And so, for example, lies, like all lies, don't have the same consequences. Some lies have some consequences, other lies have others, as specific lies. But there's something that makes all lies examples of lies, right? And so that means that if you're looking at types of actions, you're probably looking at some feature of the type of action that makes a whole type good or bad. And that's the way that the Kantian and many other non-consequentialists approach that question of ethics. Now, this is a big difference between them, but what I want you to notice is that both of them agree that what makes something right or wrong has something to do with actions, that that's the central thing to pay attention to when talking about ethics is action. And that's an interesting difference. That's where virtue ethics is going to step away from these two other traditional views. But before we actually get to what the virtue ethics approach is and how it works, I want to spend some time motivating even looking for a different approach, even looking for a different way of having things than utilitarianism or Kantianism. And the first way of taking a look at this particular question is to look at the really excellent article by Susan Wolf, which is in your online readings, called Moral Saints. And of course, what follows here is only the barest summary of it. Of course, the real meat is in the article itself. But the reason I've assigned this is to take a look at a reason for taking a different approach to moral theory than the utilitarian or the Kantian approach. And so what Susan Wolf is up to here is she seeks to identify a kind of deficiency in each of our main theories of ethics by turning each of them up to its maximum and imagining the result. So if you take your utilitarian and sort of turn the knob all the way up, or you take your Kantian and you turn the knob all the way up, well, you see what happens. Try and imagine the result, and that may tell you something about some feature of the theory. It's an interesting way of thinking. And so let's think along with her for a minute and imagine a totally committed utilitarian or a totally committed Kantian. The reasoning is going to be that if we don't like what we see, that there may actually be something wrong then with utilitarianism and or Kantianism. And so Susan Wolf says, that stipulates that there might be two different kinds of moral saint. She calls these the loving saint and the rational saint. And the loving saint has only one motivation, right? The only real motivation the loving saint has is in fulfilling the greatest general good. So the sort of motivations that you or I might have for, tacos or being good at pole vaulting or, watching a particular television series, all those motivations, they're all channeled into just one thing in the loving saint. Their only motivation is in fulfilling the greatest general good. Whereas the rational saint has all of the same ordinary motivations as you or I have. They desire, tacos and television, all that sort of stuff. But there's really no necessary connection between their motivation and their duty. And so they simply always do their duty, however they feel about it themselves. Right? They're sort of this, in a sense, perfect, perfect rational being. And so if it wasn't obvious by the descriptions here, the loving saint is, in effect, the perfect utilitarian, right? Somebody who's all consumed by fulfilling the greatest general good, picking the single action that always has the best overall consequences. While the rational saint is sort of the perfect Kantian, the person who acts only from duty and only simply because it is their duty. Now, she starts off her article in a very interesting way. She says something to the effect of, I don't know any moral saints, but I'm kind of glad I don't know them, and I'm glad that nobody I care about is one of those people. And that's an interesting thing to say, right? I mean, you normally would say, oh, yeah, it'd be great if I was a moral saint. It'd be great if the people I knew were moral saints. So I hope my children are moral saints or something like that. I mean, that seems to be the thing that somebody would say rather than, I'm really glad there aren't any, and I would hate if somebody I cared about was one of those. But she's going to describe what she means by that over the length of, the first several pages of the paper. And so one of the things she points out is that they have a very singular focus. And that singular focus makes moral saints live a life that is not real well suited to human flourishing, that is, to have a really good life for themselves. Um, as might any life, of course, that is all consumed by a single concern, even if that concern is morality. They have little or no concept of the amoral, that is, the aspects of our life that have no moral significance. And again, the examples that she supplies are really excellent. I'm not going to duplicate them here, just see those first few pages of the reading. But then the third problem is that they also have little or no concept of the supererogatory, that is, things that are morally good but not morally required. Right, and so common sense morality seems to say that there are plenty of aspects of your life that don't have any moral significance, right? Like which sandwich you make yourself for lunch, whether you put mustard on it or not, whether I mean, it's all sorts of those things that just seem to have no moral content in and of themselves, and so it kind of doesn't really matter. But there are also other things that yes are morally good, like giving somebody a kidney or donating your entire salary or something like that. I mean, those are good things to do. They're nice things to do. They might be praiseworthy, but they're not necessarily required of anybody. And so the moral saint, of course, since they're maximally moral, would have no use for the amoral, right? There would be nothing amoral in their lives. Their lives are entirely consumed by morality. And they would also have nothing that was above and beyond their duty. Everything that was their duty would simply be their duty, right? There would be no way to rise above it, because both utilitarian and Kantian theories are demanding in at least that way. And so if we really turn the knob all the way up, right, make somebody as moral as possible, according to these kinds of theories, it seems maybe we get something that we don't like very much. So another way of motivating the kind of departure from action-based ethical theories and into something else is, I think, really excellently done by Hill, who gives us, one of our other readings, the other reading in the Schaefer-Landau book. And toward the beginning of this article, he gives us a couple of examples, and here's one of those. So consider a man who, after his grandmother is dead, right? They, read, the inheritance, all that, and he goes all by himself, no witnesses and everything like that, and he spits on her grave, right? Now, I mean, this is kind of gives you a certain feeling of objectionableness. It seems like that's the wrong thing to do, or there is objectionable in some way. Uh, and but think about why. What's actually wrong with this? Because first off, the act really seems to have no bad consequences, right? It harms nobody. Nobody saw it. Nobody could, it seems like, again, it just doesn't have any consequences, or if they do, certainly none of them are particularly bad. And so what's wrong with it isn't probably going to be its consequences. Also, the act seems not to violate anyone's rights or duties, right? It doesn't really take advantage of anyone else's good behavior. It doesn't seem to violate, that Kant's universalizability principle. It doesn't use anybody as a means, right? There's, again, from the Kantian perspective, it's hard to find anything particularly wrong with this action. Again, yet the act seems morally disturbing in some way. It's these kind of concerns that could motivate us to doubt that the main question of ethics has to do with actions at all. Because here we have this action, and it honestly doesn't seem like it's the action itself that is problematic. Again, because it doesn't have any bad consequences, it doesn't seem to violate anybody's rights or anything like that. Instead, most of us would say something like, well, look, what kind of person would do something like that? Or if this person simply asked, would there be anything wrong with spitting on the grave of my grandmother? You'd say, what kind of a person even asks that question, right? That they want to look, examine that kind of an action for its right or wrong making features. Maybe it's not nothing to do with the actions at all. And so this is where virtue ethics departs from these other theories of ethics. For virtue ethicists, the central question of ethics is not about actions. That is, it's not about what to do, it's about character. It is, in other words, about how to be. And so that brings us to virtue ethics itself as a moral theory. Virtue ethics, despite being saved for last in this particular course, and it's reasonably common to do it that way for whatever reason, is actually the most ancient of our ethical theories that we'll be covering today. Utilitarianism dates back to mostly the 18th century. Kantianism back to the sort of 18th and 19th, right? So really, our other moral theories are moral theories of the last couple hundred years. They're post-Enlightenment moral theories, whereas virtue ethics is quite ancient, right, and was quite durable throughout most of the ancient and medieval worlds. It was the approach taken by Aristotle, which is where we mostly get our ideas about how virtue ethics is supposed to work, in a book he wrote called the Nicomachean Ethics. The reason it's called that is because he wrote it for his nephew, Nicomachus. It was actually the first book in the Western tradition to treat ethics as its own topic. For a brief digression here, the statue you see on the right here is a statue of what Aristotle probably looked nothing like. There are some sources we have that sort of mention him. Some people contemporary to Aristotle who mentioned that, contrary to fashion, he sort of shaved his head and his face, went clean shaven and bald in a sense. But this is a Roman era sculpture. It would have been it would just been impossible conceptually for a Roman to have sculpted the philosopher Aristotle without the philosopher's beard. There was a sort of a big fixation between philosophy and beards in the Roman world. In fact, one particular episode had the Emperor Domitian had a number of sort of philosophers, educated people, essentially making some trouble, and so he made a demand of them either shave or die, and they chose death. So if you're really curious about this connection between sort of beards and philosophy, you can sort of ask me at a later time. Send me a message or something like that. I'll try and explain that a bit. Another brief digression, I think people don't necessarily appreciate how much we really owe to a lot of ancient thinkers in terms of what impact they have had on the modern world, Aristotle in particular. It's mentioned here that he wrote the first book treating ethics as its own topic. He also wrote a lot of what were called comparative politics, right, where he sort of traveled around and sort of wrote down what kinds of governments people had, how they were constituted, and all that stuff, what they did for this, that, and the other thing. And so in a lot of ways, he was the first ever sort of comparative political scientist. He wrote a lot about literary criticism, about criticism of the arts, especially criticism of drama, and criticism of public speaking. And if you take courses in all those fields, you're probably going to start with Aristotle's criticisms. In fact, if you take a speech class, when you start giving persuasive speeches, they're going to talk to you about logos, ethos, and pathos. And that's, again, straight out of Aristotle, because he pretty much nailed it on the first try. Aristotle, if you study biology, you'll see that there's all these genus and species names. Or if you go to a natural history museum, you see these sort of two Latin names. This is called the taxonomy system. It was invented by a guy named Carolus Linnaeus, and he based it on Aristotle, who he did a lot of work sort of going out into the world, looking at nature and saying, what kinds of categories are meaningful here? What are the most meaningful ways to split up plants and animals based on what they have in common and based on their differences, right, into sort of different species of plants and animals, right? That's Aristotle there. In terms of like early alchemy, studied things that had these essential natures, right? The earth, air, fire, and water, and this is largely based on Aristotle. And so Aristotle is responsible for the very earliest forms of chemistry. He wrote a lot about motion, about causes, about all sorts of things, and they collect those books together and call them the physics, which is largely why modern physics that studies those same things is even called physics. It's due to Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, is still foundational in philosophy, read for a whole number of reasons, still important to philosophy. And also, Aristotle basically invents a system of formal logic, right? He's one of the first people ever to just notice that logic is the result of the structure of our claims and not the content of our claims. And without that focus on logic, we would not have been able to achieve the kind of mathematical sophistication we eventually achieved in the Western world. And certainly there would be no such things as computers. A lot of people think that computers are machines for doing mathematics, but that's not exactly true. They're actually machines for doing logic, and if you have a logic machine, then you can make it do mathematics. But without the central insights of logic, the central abstract notions, there certainly would be no computers. And somebody else might have come up with some of those notions, but I'm not entirely sure it would have been very soon. Aristotle was a very singular person here. I'm doubtless forgetting several of the important things that he was among the first to do. So on with the story. So he starts off the Nicomachean Ethics very early on with this sort of a warning. He says, don't expect more precision than the subject matter admits of. And so he starts off this examination with what later scholars will call the function argument. The function argument is going to be Aristotle's attempt to say, like, to get a basis for ethics. What are we even doing here? And of course, since he's really the first person doing this, he's starting from scratch. He's sort of making it up as he goes along, and it's really remarkable how good and how sensible his account really is. And so here's where he starts. He says every action is aimed at some goal or aimed at an end. It depends on the translation you look at. Sometimes they use the term ends, sometimes they translate it goals. So either way, no matter what you end up reading in terms of Aristotle here. I should note here that this account I'm giving of Aristotle is more complete than what the reading itself that's in the Schaefer-Landau book includes. Right? It's a brief cutting of some of this larger material. So you'll notice that some of these quotations are not in the original, and some of them are. And that's okay. Right? I'm going to give you the full picture, and then we're going to have you read some of the stuff that Aristotle needs. You get a little more detail in the reading from. So first off, he says every action is aimed at some goal. Well, this seems perfectly obvious, and so it makes a good premise to start with. And he says accomplishing that goal, whatever is aimed at, then is what he calls the characteristic function of whoever aims at that goal. In other words, what makes a thing what it is the goal that is aimed at. Okay, so that's it's much clearer when we give examples. For example, the characteristic function of a house builder is the goal of building good houses. The characteristic function of a flute player is playing the flute well. Because, of course, you can't be a flute player unless your goal is playing the flute well, right? And what makes a house builder is that they have a goal of building houses well. Nobody else has such a goal as a characteristic of what they're doing, right? And so that's his function argument here. He says, look, there's a kind of thing, right, that everything aims at, and whatever it aims at is what makes it the kind of action that it is. And so then he says every goal has standards of quality that come with that particular goal. We have some idea of the kinds of things that make good houses. They have to be, of course, safe. They have to be sturdy. They have to be comfortable. They have to be well laid out. We pretty much agree on most of the standards of quality for good houses. Now, of course, we might disagree on details here or there, but the major ones, there's substantial agreement. And so he wants to say, look, human life is also an activity, right? It's an action, being alive, sort of doing the human thing. And so it also then must have a characteristic function. That is, there must be some goal toward which human life is geared, right? That sort of makes human life what it is, that sort of distinguishes it from any other kind of life. And so then it leads us to this reasonable question. Okay, what is then the goal of human life? And what are the standards of quality for it, if human life is an action like any other? And so here is where Aristotle moves into the goal of a human life. He says, okay, just ask everybody. He says, everybody agrees, right? That the goal of human life is happiness. Right? And honestly, you go around today, take a survey. What's the goal of human life here? What's your goal? And people say, "Oh, I just want to be happy," right? Something like that. You'll get a lot of that. Right? You might get people who very misunderstand the question and various things like that, but you'll get a lot of the goal of human life is happiness, right? It'll do just fine. However, this word happiness here, right, is a pretty unfortunate translation. Some translations translate it happiness, some don't. The one that Schaefer-Landau provides is a little better in a lot of ways. It includes some of the Greek originals along with the English words that they translate them. That's becoming more of a scholarly standard thing to do. The reason that this translation is unfortunate is that when the modern English speaker thinks of happiness, they think of the feeling of being happy, right? This is a kind of pleasure, right? That's not really what Aristotle is after here, right? It's not a feeling. The word that Aristotle used is the Greek word eudaimonia, right, which means something more like well-being or fulfillment than happiness. And of course, Schaefer-Landau does mention this himself. But of course, now we're going to say, all right, okay, so if the goal of human life is eudaimonia, what is eudaimonia? What does it consist of? What is this fulfillment or well? And so Aristotle turns his attention to that. He says, what is this eudaimonia? So he dismisses some answers that others supply to that question, what is eudaimonia? He says, let's ask around a little bit, right, and see what sort of merit we find in the answers that people commonly give. So he says the most common, he says the masses, right, the sort of the hoi polloi, the common clay, right, the sense is, the morons, right, the masses say that the life of pleasure is eudaimonia. But Aristotle thinks that this is sort of vulgar, right? It's not very, very fitting for a human being. In fact, it's this exact section that people will use to turn into the philosophy of swine objection to utilitarianism. It says, look, if the life of pleasure is all that's important, then we're no better than pigs in slop. And that's pretty much what Aristotle is saying here about the masses. They say, no, eudaimonia is just pleasure. And he says, that's too base for a proper life of a human being. But of course, he says politicians, right? Sort of the sort of higher class of folks, the people who are active in the city and usually sort of more prominent and wealthier, the honorable classes, in other words. They say that eudaimonia is in honor, right? But Aristotle points out that honor requires other people to honor you. Surely somebody could live well without others honoring them all the time, right? So he thinks that answer isn't very good either. So Aristotle wants to contrast three different kinds of lives to try and zero in on this idea of what the characteristic function of the human life is. What is it that makes human life distinct and what it really ought to be? What goal does it aim after? So he talks about the life of mere survival, right? That is the life of just staying alive, just growth essentially, right? This is the vegetative life, right? And he rules this out. He says this can't be the characteristic life of a person, not a human being here, because even plants do this, and so there must be more to life for us. We have to have different goals than just to survive and grow. There's, of course, then the life of pleasure. This is what he calls the animal life, right? And again, this can't be the characteristic life of a person, not a human being anyway, because even animals do this, and so there must be more to life for us. And he ends up with this third life, this life of virtue and reflection, which will be the best life for a person because only human beings can live the life of virtue and reflection because it uses our faculty of reason and practical reason, right? This is the characteristic function then of human life. He says that the characteristic function, the goal at which human life aims is the life of virtue and reflection. And so I want to pause here for a second to highlight a difference, and again another difference between virtue ethics and some of the other moral theories that we've taken a look at. We've seen previous moral theories sweep prudence aside in favor of what morality demands. Remember, prudence is basically duties to the self, right? We examined ethical egoism and found that it went a little too far, and basically saying that there is only prudence, that there are only duties to the self. We think that's not particularly plausible. We think that we do have duties to others. But of course, once you hit utilitarianism, you don't really have any duties to yourself per se. You only have duties to the greatest general good. And if those things happen to make you happier, lucky for you. And if they don't, well, unlucky for you. You still have to do them anyway. And so, in a sense, utilitarianism entirely sweeps aside prudence in favor of, morality. Uh, Kantianism works in a similar way. It doesn't really matter what you want or what benefits you or what is in your interest. What matters is what is compatible with the moral law as revealed by reason in the categorical imperative. And again, if that happens to be good for you, great, lucky you. If that happens to be bad for you, well, bad luck for you, you still have to do it. And so again, both of those theories tend to sweep aside prudence largely in favor of what morality demands in terms of our duties to it, right? To either the greatest general good or to the moral law. Virtue ethics is going to be a little different. So Aristotle's going to argue that the best life for a person, right, for any person, the objective best life, that is the most prudent life, just is the life of virtue. And so, what morality requires of us is, in fact, that we live the best life. Now, of course, some of our virtues are going to be other regarding, but the presence of the virtue itself, these other regarding virtues, are going to be part of what makes a person live the life of virtue. So, in a strange way, this virtue ethics is going to combine prudence, and prudence is simply one of the virtues. And so there's not going to be this kind of a tension between prudence and morality, right? Aristotle says that being moral just is the best thing for you, even if it doesn't seem like the most fun from the outside or something like that. Again, recall these three lives that he talks about. It may be that somebody wants to live the life of a pig in the mud, but of course that person does not have a refined set of desires that are appropriate for human happiness. And so Aristotle really addresses this. He says, look, why should people want to live the life of virtue as opposed to the life of pleasure or something else? And so he writes this. Okay? He says, for pleasure is a state of soul, and to each man that which he is said to be a lover of is pleasant. For example, not only is a horse pleasant to the lover of horses, and a spectacle to the lover of sights, but also in the same way, just acts are pleasant to the lover of justice, and in general, virtuous acts are pleasant to the lover of virtue. Now, for most men, their pleasures are in conflict with one another because these are not by nature pleasant, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant, and virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for men as well as in their own nature. Their life, therefore, has no further need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but it has pleasure in itself. For besides what we have said, the man who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call a man just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor any man liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions. That's not political liberal, that's liberal in the sense of being sort of free, right? And similarly, in all other cases, if this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant. So the analogy seems to be that that a lover of the best life is pleased by the best life. So to live the best life, we have to be able to modify our character traits to fit with the life of virtue. So he says, really, the best life for a person isn't just giving them what they think they want. The best life for a person consists in aligning their desires, aligning their being with the virtues, right? And that gives us pleasure in the things that we ought to take pleasure in. It's a very interesting move. And so we'll talk a lot more here about desires, right? Desires are just one part of what we call character, that is how a person is. Right? A character trait, this is an important definition here, is a stable disposition to act a certain way in certain circumstances, right? For example, a generous person is disposed to give when they see need, right? So in order to be generous, you don't have to spend every waking moment giving something to somebody, right? Again, it's a disposition, right? To act a certain way in certain circumstances. So not all of your virtues and not all of your character traits are always on display all the time. Some of them come out when in some situations and others in other situations. And the point is, are the appropriate ones coming out in your case? That's how you determine a good character versus a bad character. And so often modern persons regard desires as things that just come with a person that can't or shouldn't be changed, at least at one level. But at another level, we often seek to raise our children with positive character traits, that like honesty or patience, and we teach them to avoid negative character traits like selfishness or having a bad temper, indicating that we do think that you can modify people's desires in certain ways, right? And so, one example of sort of contemporary struggles to modify desires, right, are struggles with addictions or other bad habits. Everybody does this with something. And our approach to these issues is very strongly reminiscent of Aristotle's approach to ethics in general. So, to take one example, a person might decide to quit smoking because life is longer or more pleasant without the smoking, or because they wish to be a better example to their children, or because smoking might inhibit other virtuous behavior, right? Notice what's not going on here. They're not necessarily saying, let's see, if I quit smoking, will it contribute to the greatest general good? Not typically. Or they say, am I violating anyone's rights by smoking? And so then I should do this. I have a duty to not. There's a lot of that. You could probably construct utilitarian and Kantian cases for not smoking, but the virtue ethics case seems a lot more natural, and it fits a lot better with the reasons that people actually give for trying to kick bad habits or other forms of addictions. And these kinds of motivations, again, they generally match a desire to live the life of reflection and virtue, that is, to live the best life. And so, how do you change your desires? How do you change your character? How do you acquire or modify your character traits? And Aristotle, again, has a very straightforward, commonsensical answer. He says, the virtues we get by first exercising them, as also happens in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts. This is confirmed by what happens in states. He said that in governments, countries, right? For legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them. And this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not effect it must miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution, that is a good form of government, differs from a bad one, and the extent to which it encourages good habits as opposed to bad habits. Um, and so I'll take a brief digression here. When we were talking about addiction on the previous slide, one of the things, if you do a lot of addiction research, and that's one of the things I've done quite a lot of, some of my research in philosophy has to do with the way that people make decisions with regard to addictions and other things like that. It was sort of a part of my research interest. You end up reading a lot of stuff from various people who research addictions and addiction behaviors, and so a lot of this research and practical wisdom comes from various 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or AA. And AA has a saying for basically everything, and a lot of these sayings encapsulate basic good advice, right? That gets sort of encapsulated down in a very easy to remember and easy to repeat way. A very important thing when you're trying to help people turn their lives around. And a lot of AA's little, sayings are kind of Aristotelian in a lot of ways, or sort of, kind of virtue ethics oriented. And one particular one that springs to mind with this particular quote is they're saying, "Fake it till you make it." Okay, and what this means is that if you're really unhappy, right, with going through withdrawal or making needed changes in your life, or you're really unhappy about where your life is, well, act happy about it, right, and eventually you'll become happy about it. And it's really interesting that this sort of an approach actually has clinical support. Various studies have indicated things like, for example, if you walk around smiling at everybody, you'll eventually start reporting actually feeling better, feeling happier. So the idea is if you act happy, you'll get happy. The other thing is if you sort of act all angry about things, you'll get all angry about things, right? It'll sort of feed on itself, and so you can by habit, by sort of consciously willing yourself to change some things, you can in fact change your character. And so we modify our character traits again by habituation, by training. And so at some point, right, somebody has to teach us or show us what it means to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, cheerful, obedient, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, for example. And this is what is meant by training, right? And it's most effective for the young, right? At some point, we have to be trained into what the virtues are. And this is where Schaefer-Landau mentions one of the key features of virtue ethics is that it relies on moral exemplars, right? That is, it relies on what would the virtuous person do in some particular case. And that's oftentimes how virtue gets taught, is by looking at an exemplar. Oh, be like this person or be like that person. Or you'll tell stories about how somebody does a particular thing, like the sort of the fictional stories about George Washington, who did not tell a lie, right? He was sort of virtuously honest in these situations, right? And so those are the kind of lessons you give to the young. And beyond just training, that is, we form habits that make virtuous behavior part of our nature. To make honesty a part of your character, you must be honest until you do so without even trying or thinking about it. Right? If you practice something enough, it doesn't become sort of something you think about. Right? If you've ever tried to sort of perfect a golf swing or something like this, you have so much crap going through your head, and you screw it up and you screw it up and you screw it up. But the more you practice, the less stuff that's going through your head, and you just go out there and hit the golf ball, and it actually does what you want it to do. And that's where all of this habituation and training really does make a difference. It makes it automatic. For example, how many of you even think about how to write each letter when you're handwriting? It's just, again, it's become automatic through practice. And so when you get a bad habit, it takes even more effort to first break the bad one and then replace it with a good one. And so if we're following Aristotle this far, we can then ask how we determine which character traits are virtuous. Again, we want to know what we're trying to habituate and train. And his answer is as follows. He says, first, let us consider this. And this is part of what is, in fact, in the reading assigned in the Schaefer-Landau collection. Let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. For to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too is it then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. So Aristotle's a sort of master at arguing by analogy. And so he says, look, just like too much or too little food will eventually destroy your health, too much or too little of a particular personality trait or a particular character trait might destroy a virtue. And so this introduces a kind of general method that Aristotle follows for determining virtue, deciding what is virtuous and what isn't. He says there are three kinds of disposition, then, two of them vices, involving excess and deficiency respectively, and one virtue, that is, the mean. Every character trait is expressed by some name or another, like we have names for character traits that people have, and any competent speaker of the language knows whether such names describe good or bad character traits. For example, anybody would enjoy being referred to as competent or honest, right? Everybody would not enjoy being referred to as unscrupulous or weak or cowardly or something like that, right? I mean, we know which of these words are good and which ones that aren't. And so he says all of these words will describe either a virtue, right, something that's good that we want, or two, some vice of deficiency, that is a lack of a particular attribute, and that's bad, or a vice of excess, that is too much of a particular attribute, and that's also bad. So leads to the common misinterpretation or misreading that a lot of people say, oh, Aristotle said everything in moderation. Well, not precisely. So, for example, cowardice is not good in moderation. You don't want a little bit of cowardice. Cowardice is already having not enough of something. It's having not enough bravery. It's bravery that is the mean between cowardice on the one hand, having not enough of it, and recklessness on the other hand. That's having too much bravery. It's bravery that's the desirable middle ground between these undesirable lacks and excesses, right? So cyanide is also not good in moderation, right? So again, all things in moderation is something of a misreading of Aristotle. He is going to say, however, there is oftentimes a virtue that exists between a deficiency of that virtue and an excess of that virtue. So there are definitely good things, and the more of that good thing you can have, the better, as long as it doesn't become excessive or unproportional. So again, cowardice is what happens when somebody lacks courage. Courage is the virtue, and when someone lacks courage, they have the vice of deficiency of courage called cowardice. Someone has too much courage, they have the vice of excess called rashness or recklessness. That's how it works. And so there seem to be as many virtues as there are positive ways to describe character. And so, like I said, we could come up with huge lists of how many virtues there are, but we could also come up with some reasonable shorter lists that reduce things to a set of sort of core virtues. And here are at least some of them. I don't tend to give you every virtue here, but again, here are some of the ones that crop up a lot, right? The ones that you can sort of apply to lots and lots of different circumstances. One of those would be the virtue of temperance. Okay, this is a very important virtue for Aristotle. Temperance is the ability to resist what one ought to resist, even if that thing is pleasant. Right? So dieters know about temperance. What they try and do is they try and resist the kinds of foods that they ought to resist, even though those foods are very pleasant to eat. And so somebody who has not enough temperance, that is, and not enough of an ability to resist what they ought to resist, is called intemperate or licentiousness or sybaritic or overindulgent. What they do is they satisfy appetites to too great a degree or with too much frequency. Right? It's a way of having a kind of bad character trait that you could try that you need to break yourself of again by habit. It's one of those things about dieting is that you have to essentially people talk diets don't work, lifestyle changes work, and that's really good advice, and it's very Aristotelian advice. It says you don't want to simply do a different thing a couple of times. Instead, you want to be a different person, and that's where you're really trying to change your character. Whereas the vice of excess is something like asceticism, right? This is foregoing things which really are acceptable to partake of. So if you could take temperance overboard and sort of not indulge in anything enjoyable just because it's enjoyable, right? That would be going a little bit too far for the sake of human flourishing. Right? So the virtue here is temperance. Another really good virtue is sort of the opposite of that coin, and that is the virtue of fortitude, right? Fortitude is the ability to pursue what one ought to pursue, even if it is unpleasant. So another way to put it is it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it, right? And so the idea is the ability to make yourself do things that you don't want to do. It's an important trait to have. And if you just don't have enough of it, right, you're often called weak or irresolute. In a sense, you're not being able to do what needs to be done. Right? You're too squeamish, perhaps, is another good phrase for that. Whereas it's possible to have too much fortitude. Again, this might be a kind of ascetic, right, or overly stoic, right? A person should not seek out unpleasantness, and they should be somewhat deterred by it, right? I mean, the idea is that if you sort of crave this sort of dirty, and maybe that's a little beyond the pale, right? The idea is that again, you want to recognize it as unpleasant. Like nobody likes to clean out their refrigerators, but you do have to do it from time to time, right? It's unpleasant, but you got to. And so some other virtues that follow Aristotle's scheme are things like friendliness, right? This would be being neither clingy, that is, having an excess of friendliness, nor cold, right? Having a deficiency of friendliness. Truthfulness, of course, you don't want to be a liar. You don't want to have a lack of a deficiency of honesty, but you also don't want to just be blunt or rude or just say everything that you think, right? That would be having an excess of honesty. Right? Rather, the honest person is going to be somewhere in between those two things. Wit is a virtue, right? Humor is a very good thing. It's a very essential part of human life. If you don't have enough of a sense of humor, you're humorless. But if you take humor too seriously or humorous too often, you're kind of a clown, right? And so again, the virtuous person has wit, but is neither humorless nor is a clown. And of course, remember right at the beginning we talked about uh, not expecting more precision than the subject matter will allow. Well, look, wisdom doesn't really fit into this scheme here. It doesn't seem like there's an excess of wisdom, right? So wisdom is going to be knowing the difference between the virtues and vices, right? That's something we should want as much of as we can, right? Is the ability to discern truthfully what's really going on. Wisdom is extremely valuable, and the more of it, the better. And so it does have a deficiency, right? You can be not wise enough, but you probably can't be too wise. You probably can't have too much knowledge of virtue. And that's largely what wisdom is. And so, again, they don't all fit into this schema, but many of them do. And it's the sort of thing you should expect at least some reasonable exceptions if you're dealing with something as sort of nebulous and complicated as morality. And so, just as other moral theories had aspects of them that were really sort of liked by the proponents of those theories, and one of the things that a virtue ethicist really likes about virtue ethics is the fact that it allows for a great deal of what we call moral complexity. So the number of factors involved in any difficult moral problem matches up very well with the number of things to consider when considering all relevant virtues. When you're deciding what kind of a person to be, you have lots and lots and lots of different and competing concerns. And that's one of the things that virtue ethics has about it is that it's very complex. But the person who really likes virtue ethics says, yeah, so is morality. So we ought to have, our moral theory ought to be just as complex as morality in itself is, right? They think something like utilitarianism or Kantianism is too simple, right? It makes it boils things down too much and it doesn't really get the same notion of moral complexity that we observe. Also, this notion of moral understanding, this idea that sort of a full appreciation of morality doesn't seem to be only a grasp of certain moral facts, but appears to be a kind of experiential wisdom. So, for example, with a utilitarian, all you'd really have to know in order to know what actions were right or wrong were what the consequences were. And in principle, those consequences could be known by anybody. And so it might make a lot of sense, this is Schaefer-Landau's example, it might make a lot of sense then to just simply consult a 5-year-old if that 5-year-old happened to know the consequences. Whereas in ordinary life, we don't really consider consulting 5-year-olds for moral advice. Not that a 5-year-old can't, on occasion, have an important moral insight. Sometimes they can. Sometimes you have cases like, the emperor's new clothes, where it seems to be the child coming at it from the outside that says, hey, why is this the case? And everyone else has to say, oh, well, actually, there's not any good reason for that, right? But again, we don't generally regard the very young and very inexperienced as really excellent moral exemplars. Instead, if you have a really difficult problem, you're probably going to go to somebody who's older, who's lived a lot of life experience, and you're going to place a lot more stock in their advice. And virtue ethics might explain why you would want to do that. Because they have spent much longer grappling with these sorts of things, right? They've had much longer to train themselves. They've had much, you can sort of see them as exemplars, right? They have this more practical experience, experiential wisdom. And that tends to lend itself well to a kind of virtue ethics approach. Also, if we go back to the beginning to Susan Wolf's argument about the undesirability of moral saints, again, imagining the virtuous saint, imagining sort of the perfect Aristotelian, really doesn't seem to have the same drawbacks as the saints implied by other moral theories. The virtuous saint, in fact, would seem to be quite desirable. I mean, just imagine it. The virtuous saint is very honest, but isn't going to say everything that they think, and they're going to be funny, but they're not going to be clownish, and they're going to be generous, but they're not going to ruin themselves, and they're going to they're going to be just, they're going to be fair to everybody, but they're going to be fair in contexts where it matters, and other contexts they'll sort of let things be. And they're going to do all of this stuff more or less automatically. It's just the kind of person they are that will do these sorts of things because they've sort of trained themselves and habituated themselves to act that way. And so we think, my goodness, somebody who just sort of automatically does, sort of the right thing in a case and exhibits this kind of impressive balance in their life between all these various different relevant virtues, that actually sounds pretty desirable. That sounds like a person we would want to be and that we would hope our children become, much more so than the loving saint or the rational saint that Susan Wolf describes. But of course, like all other moral theories, this one has some objections. It's not a perfect moral theory. There are problems with it, just like there are problems with Kantianism and utilitarianism. And we're going to look at those problems mostly because this is a pretty good theory. It's worth looking at its problems instead of sort of, simply saying, well, here's a problem that sort of just disqualifies it, like we've seen with some others. So one problem, and again, I'm paraphrasing from Schaefer Landau. His account, of course, has much more detail, and so I would encourage you to look there. But he talks about this notion of tragic dilemmas, where in a certain kind of tragic dilemma, so a great example is Sophie's Choice, which if you haven't sort of read the literature or seen the film, or you should certainly do that. But the idea is that doing the right thing in a particular situation might involve doing something that you sort of feel positively terrible about. And so, the virtuous person, if their desires are supposed to be aligned with the right thing to do, shouldn't have to feel terrible about these bad situations. But again, virtue ethicists have at least some response to this. They can say, look, only a certain kind of person would, not feel anything in the face of a tragic decision, right? It's appropriate to feel sort of, devastated about really tragic decisions, even when you have to, in fact, do the right thing in the face of those tragic decisions. And so, some virtue ethicists say that that's actually they feel like they can turn that one around and make it a point in favor of virtue ethics. Again, read the Schaefer-Landau discussion for all the detail there. Also, virtue ethics theories are accused of providing a lack of adequate moral guidance, and this is pretty fair. It's a lot like other pluralistic moral theories, and virtue ethics is pretty pluralistic, much like W.D. Ross's view or something like that. That it doesn't really give you much moral guidance, other than, well, I think honestly Aristotle says, yeah, you got to sit down and reflect, right, on which of the virtues is going to be the most important one in a particular case, and you're going to try and get as much of one as you can without really sacrificing any of the others, and that's how you're going to do it. And then notice that's not very detailed guidance. That's not certainly the kind of decision procedures, the nice, neat, and clean decision procedures we get from our post-Enlightenment theories of utilitarianism and Kantianism. And of course, also, we can imagine there being quite a lot of conflict and contradiction among exemplars. The point is here that we might be able to imagine people being very virtuous, but not in compatible ways with one another. And so we might imagine equally virtuous persons disagreeing about what the best thing to do in certain cases, it really is. And so we might not be able to say, do as the virtuous person would do, because it might simply raise the question, well, which virtuous person are we talking about? There might be sort of more than one reasonable way of being a virtuous person overall. And so that's a difficulty, right? It's a problem. But there's also we call a priority problem with virtue ethics, which is one of the reasons why sort of these post-Enlightenment theories took a different direction. And it's a priority problem. And Aristotle is really perhaps the first to recognize priority problems in their own right and make a lot of use of them. His favorite example of a priority problem is the very famous chicken and egg problem. You probably heard that for years and didn't really know it was Aristotle that made it famous. But it is, right? And so briefly, the problem is this, that everybody knows you can't get chickens without eggs. And of course, everybody knows that you can't get eggs without chickens. And so which came first, the chicken or the egg? This is a kind of priority problem where it seems just as reasonable to say that one comes from the other as to say the other comes from the one, right? So it's both answers are totally reasonable, and yet both of them are unreasonable because, if you say it's the egg, it's like, well, where did you get the egg? And then if you say it's the chicken, you say, well, where did you get the chicken, right? And so, they're priority problems. So with respect to virtue ethics, the question is whether something is a virtue because it encourages us to do our moral duty, or whether something is our moral duty only because it is virtuous, right? And if this sounds like the Euthyphro problem, right? Are things right because God commands them, or does God command them because they're right? You have been very carefully noticing this sort of a thing. And of course, Schaefer-Landau himself mentions this commonality here. And again, read his account for all the details here. But really, that's what's going on, right? We can answer the question in one of two ways, each of which has some unpleasant side effects for virtue ethics. It's not quite as fatal to virtue ethics as the Euthyphro dilemma is for the divine command theory, but right, is something that a virtue ethicist has to take pretty seriously and respond to in order to have a fully worked out theory. Now, one of the things I'd like to do, just because this is the last real sort of lecture of the course, is do a little bit of a wrap up because we've seen all of our major ethical views by now. And I wanted to do a wrap up based on some codes of ethics, because codes of ethics are things that they're out there. A lot of professions have them, and they provide a good example for us to take a look at the way that people tend to apply moral reasoning in public without necessarily knowing that that's what So most professions, that is, sort of law, medicine, engineering, teaching, et cetera, all the sort of, anything with a professional standard, a professional organization, all that sort of stuff. Um, they have professional organizations like the bar for lawyers, or the American Medical Association for doctors, or IEEE for engineers, and these other sort of professional organizations that they publish, they distribute, and they hold their members to a certain code of ethics. This is the thing about professions, is that these organizations sort of decide who gets to do what. So, for example, the government doesn't decide who gets to be a lawyer. It's the American Bar Association, and the law recognizes their authority, right? So it's lawyers that get to decide who get to be lawyers, and the law recognizes that that's the case. Same with doctors. It's doctors who get to decide who gets to be doctors for licensure with the American Medical Association and other boards. Um, and it's the government that recognizes their authority. They're not actually government organizations or entities. Right. But one of the things that these organizations do, in addition to policing their own membership, they have codes of ethics. They say, here is so society trusts us with a very important job. And so that means we have to hold ourselves to a certain standard to repay that trust, right? To deserve the trust. Right. It's a very important social arrangement that we have with professions. And so this is the codes of ethics are usually very short and very general, and they often come with a longer document that sort of explains and interprets each of those much shorter points in the codes of ethics. So I'd like to take a look at one particular example. So the example that I think we can take a look at, we could have looked at sort of any of these codes of ethics because they are similar in a lot of ways. But I'm going to take a look at this one, this nursing code of ethics. Actually, a fair number of the students in this section are either in or working toward nursing professions. And so it makes a reasonably good example for the makeup of this particular course. And this is from a publication by the American Nurses Association, one of the larger professional associations for nurses. And this is their code of ethics. They actually have 9 provisions. Here are the first 5, and the next 4 are on the next slide. Let's take a quick look at them and to notice some of their features. So take a look at provision 1 for a minute. It says the nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of each person. So in a sense, what this is asking is that it's saying that it's an important part of an ethical code for to respect inherent human dignity and worth. Okay. Now that sounds a lot like one of the bases that Kant uses, right, for some of his moral rules. This whole "don't treat people like a things" rule is inherently based in recognition of interpersonal dignity. But also look at this: the nurse practices with compassion and respect. So that's not necessarily what they do. It's more like who they are, right? In what manner that they exist as a professional person. And so this first provision is a kind of exhibits the kind of reasoning that you'd see behind Kantian morality and also behind virtue ethics. Provision 2 says the nurse's primary commitment is to the patient, whether an individual, family, group, community, or population. This acknowledges, right, that there are other commitments that nurses have, and tries to establish something like a hierarchy between all the various commitments, saying that sometimes things will be sort of overridden by other things. This looks for all the world like the kind of thing that Ross would say. Right? He says, look, in taking the job, you've given yourself a certain kind of commitment that may override other kinds of things that wouldn't normally override those sorts of moral duties. Looking at provision 3, it says the nurse promotes, advocates for, and protects the rights, health, and safety of the patients. All right. Well, this is Kantianism, but of course, I mean, when we talk about sort of rights, when they talk about health and safety, they seem to be referring to them as rights that the patient has. And of course, the Kantian approach is the one that is most compatible with a discussion of personal inviolable rights. Provision 4 is a kind of utilitarian principle. It says the nurse has authority, accountability, and responsibility for practice, making decisions, and take action consistent with the obligation to promote health and to provide optimal care. This is all about the consequences. This is all about what a nurse is supposed to do and what they're responsible for doing. Right? It's not that they're responsible to try to provide optimal care. They have authority, accountability, and responsibility to provide the optimal care. Right? It's all about the consequences here. It's this is don't try, do. Okay, that's provision 4. Provision 5 says the nurse owes the same duties to self as to others, including responsibility to promote health and safety, preserve wholeness of character and integrity, maintain competence, and continue personal and professional growth. Well, if that doesn't sound like a kind of combination between Ross's prima facie duties, right? Having this sort of balance of duties, and also character, integrity, and competence, and all that sort of stuff with virtue ethics, I don't know what does. You look at some of these other provisions. It says in number 6, the nurse, through individual and collective effort, establishes, maintains, and improves the ethical environment of the work setting and conditions of employment that are conducive to safe, quality health care. So think about that one for a second. What sort of reasoning is in here? What's the main moral point of provision 6? Is it about rights necessarily? Is it about conflicts of duties? Is it about personal character? Or is it about results? I think if you read it carefully, you'll see, yeah, it looks like it's about results. Again, this is a utilitarian kind of a provision. Provision 7 says the nurse in all roles and settings advances the profession through research and scholarly inquiry, professional standards development, and the generation of both nursing and health policy. And so, in a sense, you're supposed to not only do your job, but you're also supposed to make your job easier to do by others, right? So the idea is you're supposed to make everybody better at doing the job. Again, action, doing it, consequences, utilitarianism. So in provision 8 says the nurse collaborates with other health professionals and the public to protect human rights, promote health diplomacy, and reduce health disparities. We're talking about sort of diplomacy, cooperation, and reducing disparity, that is inequality, and just protecting rights. It looks like a combination between Kantianism and some kind of contractarianism, a little bit like John Rawls. Same as the next one here, this profession of nursing, collectively through its professional organizations, must articulate nursing values, maintaining the integrity of the position, and integrate principles of social justice into nursing health policy. Right, this is the kind of thing, no, we want the system to be the way that people would choose it to be without necessarily knowing who they would be. So the idea is that it's supposed to fulfill a particular social role. And again, that seems to be a sort of a Rawlsian form of contractarian thought. Now, the point of all this is to say that if you look at any code of ethics, you're probably going to see a similar blend. You're going to see some elements of our codes of ethics that look just explicitly at consequences. They say what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to do the right specific things to get the best outcomes. And you'll see other sort of elements of this moral reasoning that say, no, you're supposed to follow the right procedure to do the right kind of thing and avoid doing the wrong kind of thing, which is precisely Kantian reasoning. And you'll see other things that will say you're supposed to act in agreement with a particular social role, which is contractarian reasoning. You'll see there are conflicts between duties and they're supposed to be prioritized in this way, right? That's a kind of Rossian reasoning, a sort of pluralist reasoning. And you'll see people say, look, you're supposed to be this kind of professional, right? Here's the virtues of the profession, which of course is a virtue ethics approach. And so what I mean to suggest with all this is that when we really sit down and we really try and be careful about how to say things about the moral life or to evaluate things from the moral perspective, we very much tend to have lots of different things going on that are not entirely compatible with one another, but do have a kind of basis. And if you can recognize that basis, then you can do this kind of reasoning better. When you're using utilitarian reasoning, it's better to know the limitations of such reasoning, and it's better to know that there are alternatives. When you're using Kantian reasoning or non-consequentialist reasoning, it's good to know that there are limitations to that kind of reasoning, what those limitations are, and what some of the alternatives are, what some of the opposing viewpoints are, so that you can, by considering all of these things, at least think more better about how to make a good decision. The last thing I want is really for anybody to get decision decision freeze or something like that, or to get sort of decision lock, where they're like, oh gosh, there isn't a perfect ethical theory, so I just don't know what to do. That would, in a sense, be a great failure of all of this information. This information should overall be used to improve your ethical thinking. If, after all, you're thinking to yourself, well, why do I think this is the right thing to do? And what alternative ways are there of thinking this is the right thing to do? You're already ahead of 90% of people. Right? So that's really what I want, is I want you to think carefully about what makes something the right or the wrong thing to do, and realize that there are multiple ways of answering that question that do make, on their own, some degree of sense. And you don't want to avoid the responsibility of having to ultimately come to a decision. You do have to pick the best one, the one that seems most incumbent in the circumstances. But in this case, knowledge can be power, right? Knowledge can provide you a kind of framework. We're going to give you a toolbox where you can think about these sorts of things. And I hope in this course that that's what you have gotten. Thanks.